You're listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
You're listening to the NASP Podcast. This specialty pharmacy podcast is a collaboration with the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy and the Pharmacy Podcast Network. The mission of the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy is to improve specialty pharmacy practice by promoting continuing professional education and certification of specialty pharmacists while advocating for public policies that ensure patient access to specialty medications. As the healthcare industry's leading podcast dedicated to the pharmacy profession, the Pharmacy Podcast Network is proud to bring our listeners the NASP Podcast, in collaboration with the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy.
Hello, my name is Sheila Arquette, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Association of Specialty Pharmacy. I'm delighted to welcome a very special guest, Kathryn Eshelman, MD, MPH, to this episode of the NASP Podcast. Dr. Eshelman serves as Vice President of Clinical Informatics at Inovalon. In this role, she oversees the development of Inovalon's clinical tool sets, delivering provider decision solutions that are patient-specific at the point of care. Dr. Eshelman also served as an assistant professor in the internal medicine department at the University of Maryland, where she supervised residents in inpatient and outpatient internal medicine. Previously, she worked in underserved medicine on the Navajo Indian Reservation and is a primary care physician and director of the Diabetes Collaborative at the Family Health Center of Baltimore. Dr. Eshelman, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Sheila.
So to start off, would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. A little bit about my background. As you read, I have done primary care internal medicine for a number of years prior to moving over to Inovalon. One of the big drivers in me making that transition from seeing patients every day to working for a company like Inovalon that's really into the health analytics was sort of the day-to-day frustrations that I think pharmacists and physicians feel alike, where a lot of times the technology and the communication that is needed to really deliver the best care doesn't exist, or exists but could be a whole lot better. So that was part of my big transition and why I really love the work that I'm doing now. We're really trying to improve that day-to-day life of people who are doing that first line delivery of care to patients and make sure that the technology is helping you, not slowing you down, and not creating more work for you than you already have.
Sure. And I'm sure that experience, right, of living it, right, and being on the front lines yourself really brings, added dimension, right, to and helps you be even more successful, I'm sure, at your role at Inovalon.
It definitely brings a whole nother dimension of having experienced what it's like to, see a patient who hasn't seen a doctor in 2 years and has all sorts of, complicated health problems, and how you work that into your schedule, and that pressure that exists in the fee-for-service world, which I know we're going to talk about more value-based contracting, I'm sure, but that pressure of, how many patients did you see today being the main metric that your leadership is focused on. Pharmacists deal with that as well. How many prescriptions did you fill today? And that's, a big pressure that you're trying to manage while also trying to really give great care to your patients and not make the patients feel as rushed as you feel a lot of the time. And then, understanding that, we jump through a lot of hoops as providers to make the technology work for us. And there's always opportunities to improve upon that.
Sure. That kind of widget type model, right? Really flies in the face of personalized precision medicine if there's
Absolutely.
no time to do it.
There is no time to do it. And, you're really, especially in primary care, you are really, you don't have as much support, service and help employees to help you. And you're doing a lot of it on your own. And pharmacists are in the same boat. Every time you go to a pharmacy, you could see, in the retail side, how busy they are. And then on the specialty side, it's the same thing of really trying to maximize and take care of as many patients as you can. And if data entry is slowing you down, then that's got to improve. And all the different alerts and things that you get from your system has to be streamlined for sure.
I always thought too, like internal medicine is tough just because you have to know a lot about a lot. Right? You never know what walks through the door.
You have to be ready for whatever walks through the door. You have to exactly know a lot about a lot. And you have to make decisions that are really going to put the patient on the right path or potentially the wrong path, right? So you have to know enough that you can, know what you can treat and what you can handle and what you need to refer. And certainly, in underserved medicine, sometimes on the Navajo reservation, patients had Medicaid, but often didn't have gas money to get to the specialist that was 2 hours away. And so you have to really try to work within what the patient can actually do, or, just because it's on formulary doesn't mean that it doesn't cost $40 a month, and that can be cost prohibitive, right? So, navigating all of those things on behalf of your patients, I think, is amplified in primary care because you're dealing with every different medication and every different disease type versus a specialty where you're more focused on one particular disease and one set of medications, if you will. Right.
So you mentioned value-based care contracts. What do you view as pharmacy's role in those contracts?
Yeah, I'm so excited about value-based care. I think it's taken longer than I had hoped it would take to really take hold, but I am encouraged every year that goes by that it's becoming more of, the standard out there. We talk about doctors don't want to be measured on just how many patients did you see today, which is the true fee for service. And same thing with pharmacists. You want to be measured on how well you're taking care of the patients that come through your door. But the next step is in value-based care is trying to figure out which patients should be coming through your door today versus which patients could maybe wait to be seen for 2 months, and sort of that triage of who really needs to be seen today and why are they coming in. And I think in the pharmacy, it's a similar sort of paradigm where the value-based care is all about, I always talk about 3 legs of a stool. So you've got utilization. How much does it cost you to care for your patients? And a big metric of that is, a doctor ordering unnecessary expensive tests can be a negative on utilization, or prescribing unnecessarily expensive medications. And then there's the how sick are your patients, or the disease burden of your population. If your patients are sicker, then of course they're going to use more medicines. And then how well are you caring for your patients? So those quality measures. So, and that's where the pharmacist, I think, plays the largest role in any value-based contracts, because quality measures, some of the biggest ones are, as we know, around medication adherence. Mm-hmm. Those are the heaviest weighted star measures. When I worked in a step-down ICU at University of Maryland, and it was a closed unit, 20 beds, I could walk around the unit and say, this person's main reason for being here, their chief complaint, as we say, is because they quote unquote ran out of medications. And that could be a heart failure exacerbation. It could be an asthma exacerbation. It could be that their sugar got way too high and they ended up. And so the common denominator we know is around medication adherence. So medication adherence, obviously incredibly important. But there's a lot more that pharmacists can do beyond that medication adherence. And even within medication adherence, the pharmacists are often blind to what patients are filling potentially at other pharmacies, or medications they're supposed to be on that they aren't filling. And so getting that information is really important. But then also other kinds of, as we say, quality measures. So what else can pharmacists do? We know vaccination is huge. And I think, one thing that happened in the pandemic was a lot of Americans realized that, pharmacists are able to serve that role. But there's also, in the more specialty pharmacy side, there's a lot of counseling that can be done. There's, obviously medication counseling is happening. Are they billing for it the way they could be? Sometimes I think pharmacists aren't, and we can maybe talk a little bit more about that. But then also, just basic counseling, like, hey, it looks to me like you haven't had your mammogram, because the relationship between the patient and the pharmacist is often a closer, more trusted relationship than their primary care provider, because they're often interacting with the pharmacists more often than they are with their primary care provider with patients with serious chronic diseases.
Sure, I agree. And like we talked about, so if you're too focused on, measuring the number of prescriptions they dispensed in the day, we're never going to be able to get to that point where pharmacists could be collaborating with physicians and health plans, right, to drive some of those quality measures, or having those, annual checkup, or those, preventative screenings, right? Having that really, that important, that crucial conversation that they really could be having and should be having.
Absolutely. And then, the other thing is, as medications are getting more expensive, and I think we can all agree that a lot of the newer medications are very expensive, and we really want the best possible outcome for the patient. So, the pharmacist, I believe, needs to know that the patient was recently in the emergency room and understand why that happened, or that they were hospitalized, and understand how that played a role in their chronic disease, in the medication that they're taking. Because what we really want out of these more expensive medicines, what everybody wants, health plans, pharmaceutical companies, it's sort of a universal, that we really want the patients to be living healthier, happier lives. And what that really means is they're not ending up in the hospital or the emergency room as often. Their quality of life has shot up. So I think it's really important to be able to triangulate these different parts of the healthcare system. We always talk about the medical versus the pharmacy, but I think those two are really coming together in a really nice way, because we want to all be in it together to make sure that these medications are really serving the patients as well as they possibly can. And I'm excited about that, I think, but it's a challenge, right? Because anytime something increases in cost, we need to figure out, okay, how are we going to offset that? And how are we going to make sure that the patient is staying healthy, staying unnecessary hospitalizations, unnecessary lab work and other things? So how do we all work together to make sure that we're taking the best care of this patient? And, some of that is just making sure that we all know what's going on. The whole care coordination is solid, so that people aren't, doing redundant things, ordering tests that have already been done, or, that kind of thing is wasteful, and it doesn't help the patient, and it takes away from their quality of life. So it's a really exciting time, because I think there's a pressure in some of these more expensive medications coming onto the market that's forcing us to think differently about, how we really, as a whole, physicians, hospitals, pharmacies, everybody takes care of these patients in the best way. So I'm excited about it, but it's definitely, I think, a challenge for all of us in healthcare.
Absolutely. So what do you see as the biggest challenge with value-based care contracts being adopted, by the pharmacy or at the pharmacy?
I think the biggest challenge is that the pharmacist is still relatively in the dark. I think that the pharmacist relies on what information they can get out of the prescriber, the patient-reported information, which is often inaccurate and more often incomplete. And so I think that the biggest challenge is around really empowering the pharmacist with a platform that is easy to use, that's part of their workflow, but also has the information that the pharmacist needs to take care of the patient. Pharmacists should never have to, in my opinion, seek out the liver function test or the kidney test to see how the kidney function is doing. They should have that information. They shouldn't have to track down, the PPD, the tuberculosis testing was completed, right? So that information needs to be at the pharmacist's fingertips, it's just as important as being a physician. So I think that's a challenge that is slowly getting better. But then also, I talked a little bit about it. Pharmacists are doing medication reviews, are doing a lot of things that are reimbursable. And I think sometimes it's the fear, and physicians have this too, that if they don't document it perfectly, CMS is going to come and get them. And so that almost kind of keeps them from getting a revenue stream that CMS actually wants you to get, right? They don't put these services out and hoping people don't utilize them. But I think there is sort of that intimidation of making sure you're compliant with it and doing, crossing your T's and dotting your I's. And then understanding, how that would change your day-to-day operations in the pharmacy and how you'd have to staff to that or change different people in your staff, their day-to-day, once you do kind of tap into that. So I think that's, in my mind, the biggest challenges. It's really kind of having all the information and then really having the confidence that you're doing a lot of reimbursable things for the patient as a pharmacist beyond filling that script or, giving that vaccine.
So if you were a pharmacist, how would you utilize technology and prioritize access to data with existing workflows?
Yeah, I think what every pharmacist needs, and it's got to be integrated in whatever software they use. And I've been to enough pharmacies to know that sometimes they use more than one software platform just in their day-to-day. But what they really need to know is they really need to have analytics in place that are kind of flagging patients that you might want to worry about. So, it's what they really need is they need to know that kidney function test on every patient where it's relevant, but then they also need to know which patients who they're about to refill for, there was a change in that test, and have those kind of flagged for them so that they know that there's, surface these issues so they know that there's something that they need to potentially address with the patient. Or, they shouldn't have to scroll through the patient's vaccination history to figure out if they've had their flu shot or not. It should flag, hey, this patient looks like they haven't had their flu shot, or looks like they haven't had their mammogram. So the act of the difference, if you think about it, between asking a patient, have you had your mammogram? Have you had your colonoscopy? When was it? Have you had, your all your vaccinations that you need, versus having that served up to you and saying to the patient, hey, it looks like you're up to date with your colonoscopy. Good job. It looks like it's been a while since you've had your mammogram. That's a very different conversation. It's a much more efficient conversation. And it's actually the patients appreciate it, right? Because one thing patients get very annoyed about is regurgitating the same information over and over again. They want us to all, have all the information and to be able to. So I think that it's really around technology that can take a patient as a whole and say, okay, Mrs. Jones, you're refilling a medication for her, but these are the top 3 things that we think you might also want to talk to her about. Mm-hmm. Boom, 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 right? Because there's no time to search through the chart and figure out kind of what those, as we call them, gaps are, what those things that they need to have done are. And, their compliance should show you, this is their compliance. It's at 90% for the year, or it was at, 90% last year, and now it's down to 80. And so there needs to be very dynamic and needs to be very thoughtful, again, because there's not infinite time. So it really needs to help the pharmacist focus in on those really important things that they need to address when they have the patient's attention.
Well, it's interesting too. When you were describing that, I was thinking there's a lot of information that the pharmacy or pharmacist would have on compliance and adherence, and they could be applied beyond just medication, right? So if you see somebody that's historically non-compliant, you can probably bet they're going to be non-compliant with those screenings, right? Those annual visits,
Yes.
those immunizations. So geez, is there a way to work together to tailor the approach to this patient? Because it's different, right? People are individuals, and I think they want to be treated as individuals.
Absolutely. And our analytics look at that. They don't just look at, are you compliant with your cholesterol medication, but they're looking at, how compliant have you been with seeing a primary care provider in the past 2 years? How is that trending? Do you even have a primary care provider? There's a lot of people out there who don't, right? And so, the patient behavior is overall pretty predictable. Now, some patients are really good about some things and not about others, right? And that's important to surface as well. Some patients will always get their mammogram and never get their flu shot, and that's just who they are. But you're right. I think that patient behavior modeling is really important to have within the analytics, and even provider modeling too. How often do the providers, are the providers good at addressing certain things versus others, and where can you kind of help? Right. Maybe the primary care isn't doing a great job with vaccination, but is awesome at making sure their patients get, their mammograms, or, where can we all pitch in and work together? And so, that behavior aspect is incredibly important. And again, I would argue that a lot of practicing pharmacists don't have that kind of information even today at their fingertips, and certainly not in a prioritized way that they can kind of know what they need to focus on and what's the most important.
Right. And I think, as a pharmacist myself, I think, or at least it was my perception, that like information or like the care flows one way, right? Pharmacists may not even understand what valuable information they have to share back with you.
Yes. Because, some providers, some physicians at this stage will know whether or not a medication was prescribed, whether or not it was filled, and is it being refilled. Some won't. So a lot of times you'll see in the physician's EHR, I prescribed this drug, but the physician doesn't know until the patient follows up 3 months later whether or not the patient filled it, or whether the pharmacist had to change it to something. There's just a lot of things that happen that the pharmacist knows that the physician doesn't know. And also, there's sort of that continuity too, because if you're a new physician for the patient, but they've been going to the same pharmacy for years, think about all that information and the value of knowing what medications they've tried and failed in the past, right? So that, it is definitely a two-way street, and there's a lot of value in what the pharmacists have, and it has to be shared back with the physicians. But again, we can't avalanche information at each other. We have to be really smart about how and what we deem important to kind of put in front of each other's faces, or else it's never going to work.
Right. 100%. So as a medical provider yourself, how does the provider view the pharmacist's role in the care continuum?
Yeah. And well, very highly. And it varies. I worked as a hospitalist, and man, I used to say if we had a really good pharmacist on our team, it was like better than having an intern. I mean, it really does make a big difference in how well the patients are managed. It makes a big difference on, if they're getting discharged at the right time and the levels are checked and all of those different things are being considered. They're really good at making sure we're stopping medications that the patient doesn't need anymore, right? So there's a ton of value in the hospital, but on the outpatient side, the pharmacist is, when I worked in Baltimore, the pharmacist was part of our diabetes coalition. So, the pharmacists worked hand in hand with us in counseling the patients and setting goals with the patients on how to get their sugars down and improve their compliance. On the Indian reservation, the pharmacists actually ran their own blood pressure clinic. So they would check the patient's blood pressures. They would up the medications. We had protocols in place. And so, I have personally seen just a huge diversity in the different ways that the pharmacists play a role. And I think we always talk about, are you practicing at the top of your license? And I would argue a lot of times, the pharmacists aren't, A lot of times the physicians aren't either. And again, it's making sure that how can the technology really get you to the top of your license? Like, how can the technology get you out of the scrolling through the chart to figure something out and to surface stuff up to you? And that's what's, I think, really exciting about, the improvements in technology, certainly over the past decade.
Absolutely. Right. It takes away some of that busy work that can be all consuming. Right.
Oh my gosh.
Like you said, from doing the things you really should be doing that you're trained to do and that only you can do. Absolutely.
And that's where we need to get. And I think everyone benefits from that. Mm-hmm. There's no losers in that scenario. The patients benefit, and the pharmacists and physicians. I mean, the burnout, right? We can't forget about that. It was hard before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. It was hard during the pandemic, and whatever we can do to, really maximize, because pharmacists and physicians, they want to take care of the patients, and they want to spend their time really doing that. And they want to look back on their day and say, I spent the vast majority of my day really delivering care to patients. And a lot of them today can't say that. And we need to get there.
And I think probably that's where the burnout comes from, right? Because as the mom of a resident, right? And it doesn't seem like, it's the grueling hours, right, that you all have to put in as you're going through that training, or that healthcare workers in general have to work. I think it's just being caught up in that administrative burden, right? Because you're right. They're like healers. They're care providers at heart. And I think that's where they derive their energy.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, you don't mind working a long day if you felt like you've spent it really caring for people. But when you've felt like you've spent it jumping through hoops and screaming at the computer screen, then that's where I think a lot of the burnout comes in, for sure.
Absolutely. So in closing, as we gear up for the NASP annual meeting and expo in Nashville, what are you most excited for about the conference?
Yeah, I'm really excited. Well, anytime everyone comes together, it's always a great thing. And I think getting thought leaders together and hearing their different perspectives, how different systems and plans and people are working to tackle these problems. We have a session, it's called How Pharmacists Reach the Apex of Managing Cost of Care, and really talking sort of about what we talked today about how our platform is actually, used by health plans to tell the physicians, hey, these are the different gaps and things that the patient has, and how that can be pointed to the pharmacists as well. And so how can the same tool, right, working from the same, sheet of paper, the physician is seeing the same exact dashboard that the pharmacist is seeing, so that we're all kind of tracking these patients together. And how can that really improve everybody's outcomes, and how that can serve a value-based care contract? So think about, again, having that dashboard so that when a patient's filling medication, you can rapidly see, okay, she's doing great. Oh, it looks like she's non-compliant on this one medication, and maybe a few minutes about the benefit of a mammogram would benefit her, and having that right at your fingertips. I think it's the technology, but think about the pharmacists and how exciting that is for their day-to-day job to really be able to bring in the other aspects of the patient's health. I think it's a really exciting time, and you can't do it without the right technology and then the right people. So very much excited about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. As you're talking through it, I'm just thinking it's just a wonderful way to provide comprehensive care for a patient that is individualized, right? And I think that is what I think people respond best to that. But, you're not duplicating efforts. You're collaborating together. You're making sure the messaging is consistent. I used to hear that a lot, when I worked at the health plan, that one person tells me one thing, somebody else tells me something else. I don't know what to do. They get extremely frustrated. I think that can lead to, non-compliance and non-adherence as well. So just such a great way to, to look at the patient in a 360-degree view and all work together, right, to make sure that the best possible outcomes are achieved.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what's really exciting about it is taking technology that already exists and is being used on the physician delivery side and pointing that same exact technology to the pharmacist so that there is that unity and that we are not getting different information and then the patient's not getting different information. And so it is really exciting. And I think it's definitely the future of how this is all going.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eshelman, for chatting with me and sharing this valuable information.
Thank you. Anytime, Sheila.
And as a reminder, NASP corporate members are invited to be my guest on one complimentary podcast per year. For more information about this or other NASP membership benefits and events, please feel free to reach out to membership at naspnet.org or visit our website, www.naspnet.org. Until next time, have a great day.